He violently threw the divorce papers directly at her chest and laughed incredibly loudly, highly arrogantly, explicitly, telling absolutely everyone who would actively listen that he was finally, successfully trading in his highly pathetic, outdated wife entirely for a significantly younger, highly attractive model. Diego Serrano genuinely, toxically, thought he had flawlessly won. He successfully possessed the highly lucrative job, the highly expensive luxury penthouse, and the highly toxic mistress officially turned beautiful fiancée. He violently left Sarah completely with absolutely nothing but the cheap clothes on her fragile back and a violently shattered heart. But Diego completely, catastrophically committed a highly fatal, massive miscalculation. He possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea that the highly pathetic old homeless man that Sarah had generously been actively feeding entirely for agonizing months absolutely wasn't a highly pathetic beggar at all. He was officially the absolute, undisputed owner entirely of the exact same massive corporate empire that Diego was highly desperately attempting to violently join. And he had literally just tragically highly generously leaving absolutely everything, completely to the exact same beautiful woman that Diego had just violently thrown completely into the pathetic garbage. The price of ambition. The highly expensive ink completely on the highly toxic divorce papers was literally barely completely dry. Exactly when Diego Serrano highly arrogantly checked his massive Rolex, a highly expensive Submariner that he had highly selfishly bought. Entirely with their highly secure joint savings account exactly 3 agonizing months completely ago, completely without actively asking for her absolute permission. "Are we completely permanently finished perfectly here?" Diego sharply asked, completely without even actively bothering to intensely look entirely at Sarah. He was way too incredibly, highly busy aggressively sending highly toxic text messages entirely on his expensive phone. A highly mocking, toxic smile, playfully dancing completely on his handsome lips. "I officially possess a highly exclusive dinner reservation entirely at the Golden Swan at exactly 8 p.m. Vanessa violently gets incredibly irritable exactly if she actively has to highly impatiently wait entirely for her massive lobster." Sarah Jimenez sat peacefully entirely on the absolute other side, entirely of the highly freezing, cold metal table, entirely in the highly sterile arbitration room, completely in massive Madrid. Completely with her soft hands, highly tightly interlaced, perfectly in her lap, entirely, to fiercely prevent them completely from violently trembling. She intensely looked directly at the highly arrogant man she had fiercely, loyally supported entirely for exactly 7 agonizing years. She had brutally worked highly exhausting double shifts entirely in a highly busy, cheap cafeteria entirely to successfully pay completely for his highly expensive business school. She had meticulously ironed his bespoke shirts, lovingly cooked his hot meals, and highly desperately consoled him exactly when he highly pathetically failed his absolute first, highly critical licensing exams. "Diego," Sarah whispered incredibly softly, with a highly hoarse voice, "you are highly aggressively taking the massive apartment and the expensive car. Exactly how am I officially supposed to actively get completely to grueling work?" Diego finally, slowly looked completely up. His piercing eyes, exactly once incredibly warm and highly beautiful blue, were exactly now completely freezing, sharp fragments entirely of solid ice. He let out a highly cruel, incredibly sly, toxic laugh. Sarah, intensely look directly at yourself. You are absolutely just a highly pathetic waitress. You can highly easily, actively take the cheap bus. That massive apartment is strictly exclusively for highly important people who genuinely matter. Elite people completely with a highly massive future. And let's absolutely be completely honest. Perfectly here. You were absolutely always absolutely just a highly temporary placeholder completely. Until I successfully found absolutely someone who flawlessly matched my highly lucrative, brand new tax bracket. The heavy door entirely of the highly sterile conference room smoothly opened, and Vanessa confidently entered. She was exactly 22 young years old. She was a highly striking blonde and flawlessly wore a highly expensive designer coat that easily cost significantly more than Sarah successfully earned entirely in an entire, agonizing year. She absolutely did not vividly recognize Sarah. She simply confidently walked directly toward Diego and highly possessively hung completely from his broad shoulder. "Baby! The elite valet is actively waiting," Vanessa loudly whined, highly annoyingly popping a highly cheap piece of bright gum. "I am absolutely just rapidly finishing completely up entirely with the highly pathetic garbage disposal, my beautiful love," Diego stated, confidently standing completely up and smoothly buttoning his highly expensive, Italian-tailored suit jacket. He intensely looked directly at Sarah entirely, for exactly one absolute last, highly toxic time. "Do absolutely not actively contact me. My highly elite lawyer will highly officially send you the highly strict schedule entirely of exactly when you can highly pathetically, actively pick completely up your cheap cardboard boxes entirely of absolutely whatever highly pathetic garbage you absolutely still successfully possess, completely left. Oh, and Sarah, highly desperately try to successfully marry a highly wealthy, rich man, the absolute next massive time. Although entirely at exactly 30 agonizing years old, your highly pathetic odds absolutely do not visually look incredibly good." He violently threw a highly cheap €20 bill completely onto the highly freezing metal table. Exactly as if he were highly arrogantly actively tipping highly terrible cheap service. "Entirely for the highly cheap bus ticket," he toxically mocked. They confidently walked completely out, their highly toxic, loud laughter violently resonating completely down the long hallway. Sarah sat peacefully, entirely, in the highly deafening silence, entirely of the massive room. Completely with the highly cheap €20 bill intensely staring directly at her. It was the absolute, ultimate toxic insult. She absolutely did not violently scream. She absolutely did not aggressively overturn the heavy metal table. She simply incredibly slowly stood completely up, completely, with highly heavy legs, exactly like solid lead, and confidently walked completely out, directly into the highly freezing torrential rain, entirely of massive Madrid. She actively possessed a highly exhausting, grueling shift entirely at the highly busy corner cafeteria, entirely, in exactly 1 short hour. And she absolutely could not, highly possibly actively afford entirely, to confidently arrive incredibly late. Her beautiful life, exactly as she intimately knew it, had completely, permanently ended. But she possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea that her absolute, true, highly massive life was actively about to miraculously begin. Diego left Sarah with nothing but a €20 bill. What would you have done with that bill? Left it or taken it? Tell us below. The kindness of strangers. Exactly 3 agonizing months significantly later, Sarah's highly exhausting life had completely, highly peacefully settled entirely into a highly gray, incredibly grueling rhythm. She quietly lived entirely in a highly cramped, highly cheap studio apartment that aggressively smelled entirely of highly toxic dampness, entirely in a highly poor, peripheral neighborhood. Brutally working exactly 60 highly agonizing hours every single week, entirely at the corner. A highly dilapidated, cheap cafeteria perfectly on the absolute edge, entirely of the massive city's highly busy industrial park. It was a highly gloomy Tuesday, and it was actively raining completely in massive buckets completely again. The highly cheap bell, perfectly over the heavy door, loudly jingled, and a highly freezing, bitter gust entirely of cold wind violently entered. "Hey, you! Get the hell completely out!" violently yelled the highly aggressive manager. A highly sweaty, toxic man, explicitly named Ricardo, completely from directly behind the highly dirty bar. Standing perfectly entirely in the highly drafty doorway was a highly pathetic man, who visually looked exactly as if he had absolutely not successfully bathed entirely in agonizing weeks. His highly worn, highly cheap coat was highly pathetically securely held completely together, entirely with highly cheap duct tape. His highly long beard was incredibly matted, and he was violently, highly aggressively trembling, completely uncontrollably. He was highly commonly explicitly known entirely in the highly poor neighborhood exactly as Old Arturo. The absolute vast majority entirely of highly normal people actively crossed the highly busy street entirely to highly aggressively, actively avoid him. I absolutely only highly desperately wanted a highly small amount, entirely of cold water. The highly exhausted old man heavily panted, highly frantically, fiercely grabbing his weak chest. "Cold water is strictly exclusively for highly paying, highly elite customers. Get the hell completely out, completely, before I highly aggressively call the elite police," Ricardo violently screamed, aggressively reaching completely for the cheap phone. "Stop," Sarah stated firmly. Confidently stepping completely out, completely from directly behind the highly dirty bar. She visually looked incredibly tired, completely with highly dark, deep circles. But her beautiful voice was incredibly firm. "Aggressively hang completely up the cheap phone, Ricardo. Sarah, if you highly generously actively feed him, he will absolutely never, ever actively leave. He is completely, highly terrible entirely for massive business," Ricardo violently spat. "There is absolutely no one completely here, Ricardo," Sarah sharply retorted, highly aggressively pointing directly at the completely empty, highly quiet cafeteria. She confidently walked directly toward the highly exhausted old man and gently took his weak arm incredibly softly. "Come completely on, Arturo. Sit peacefully entirely in the highly quiet booth perfectly at the absolute back, perfectly near the highly warm radiator. It is significantly, infinitely warmer completely there." She highly gently sat him completely down. The highly exhausted old man intensely looked directly at her completely, with highly watery, gray eyes. He was violently trembling. "I successfully possess absolutely no highly pathetic money, miss," he whispered incredibly softly, highly completely ashamed. "I actively asked entirely for highly pathetic money." Sarah beautifully smiled incredibly softly. A highly rare, highly beautiful expression entirely in these highly agonizing days. "I am actively currently, highly actively making highly fresh, hot coffee. And the highly stressed chef absolutely made way too incredibly much highly delicious beef stew completely today. If absolutely no one highly happily actively eats it, it is actively going to completely, violently go completely to highly pathetic waste. It was a highly absolute lie. Sarah actively, highly generously paid entirely for the hot stew completely from her absolute own highly pathetic tips. Every single time Arturo confidently came, she gently brought him a highly steaming, massive bowl and a highly hot, fresh cup. Entirely while he highly gratefully ate. His highly freezing hands violently trembled so incredibly much that the highly cheap spoon loudly clattered completely against the highly cheap ceramic. Sarah sat peacefully, directly across, completely from him. She absolutely did not highly toxically treat him exactly like a highly pathetic charity case. She highly beautifully treated him exactly like a highly loyal friend. "How exactly are you successfully holding completely up, Sarah?" Arturo softly asked, completely with a significantly stronger, deeper voice, completely after the highly delicious soup. "Is that highly toxic ex-husband entirely of yours absolutely still highly maliciously bothering you?" Sarah heavily sighed, intensely looking completely out the large window directly toward the highly freezing gray rain. "I vividly saw his highly glossy photo entirely in the highly elite economic newspaper completely yesterday. He is highly actively closing a highly massive multi-billion-dollar deal completely with the highly powerful Pineda Group. He is actively going to highly expensively buy a highly massive yacht. And I am highly constantly worried entirely about successfully paying highly cheap rent." Arturo completely, violently, paused completely, with the highly cheap spoon, perfectly suspended, entirely halfway directly to his dry mouth. "The highly powerful Pineda Group, you explicitly say?" "Yes, a highly massive, multi-billion-dollar real estate and highly elite financial empire. Diego, my highly toxic ex, highly arrogantly, explicitly says he will absolutely be the absolute youngest, highly elite vice president entirely in the massive city, exactly once he successfully, flawlessly closes the massive deal completely with the highly powerful owner." Sarah laughed incredibly, highly bitterly. "He absolutely always flawlessly gets exactly what he fiercely wants." Arturo heavily lowered his massive head, flawlessly hiding a highly strange, incredibly bright gleam entirely in his piercing eyes. The highly powerful owner entirely of the massive Pineda Group is officially a highly difficult, massive man to highly successfully please, completely according entirely to exactly what I have actively heard. Perhaps Diego absolutely should not highly arrogantly actively sell the highly valuable bear's skin completely before highly successfully actively hunting it. Sarah gently reached her soft hand completely across the small table and lovingly patted Arturo's highly dirty, weak hand. "You successfully possess a highly massive, highly creative imagination, Arturo. Actively eat your highly delicious soup. You are officially a highly good, beautiful woman, Sarah," Arturo stated, his deep voice highly suddenly incredibly serious. "You successfully possess a highly pure, absolute heart. The highly toxic, massive world has absolutely not violently broken you. Even exactly, although it has highly aggressively actively attempted to. Profoundly remember exactly that." "Thank you so incredibly much, Arturo." That was officially the absolute last, highly magical time that Sarah vividly saw him. Exactly 2 short days significantly later, Arturo absolutely did not confidently appear. Exactly one agonizing week, significantly later. Ricardo highly coldly, explicitly told her that the massive ambulance had violently picked completely up a highly deceased, highly unidentified old man, entirely in the highly dark alley, exactly 2 short blocks, completely further down. He had tragically passed completely away, entirely, from highly severe pneumonia. Sarah violently cried entirely in the highly freezing cold room, entirely for exactly 10 agonizing minutes. Entirely, to absolutely everyone, completely else. He was absolutely just a highly pathetic, highly homeless beggar. But he was officially the absolute only highly genuine person who had intensely listened completely to her entirely for agonizing months. She highly generously bought exactly one single, highly beautiful white rose, completely with the highly pathetic money, completely from her cheap tips, and gently left it entirely in the highly dark alley, exactly where he absolutely, usually highly peacefully, slept. She genuinely, truly thought that exactly that was officially the absolute, highly tragic end. The billionaire's will, the highly official, massive letter confidently arrived completely by highly secure certified mail directly to the highly busy cafeteria. It was highly expensive, incredibly thick, creamy paper, completely with a highly elegant gold-embossed letterhead. Pineda and Associates, highly elite lawyers. Sarah's soft hands violently trembled exactly as she nervously opened it. She highly terrifyingly thought it was a highly massive lawsuit. Perhaps Diego was highly maliciously actively suing her completely for highly toxic spousal support. Entirely out of highly toxic spite. Dear highly esteemed Mrs. Jimenez, you are officially highly legally requested entirely to actively attend the highly official reading entirely of the absolute last will and highly massive testament entirely of Mr. Arturo H. Pineda. The highly official reading will absolutely take highly secure place exactly this highly anticipated Friday at exactly 10 a.m., completely in the massive Pineda Tower. Arturo Pineda. Sarah deeply frowned. I absolutely do not, profoundly know, absolutely any Arturo Pineda. She miraculously, almost violently threw it completely away, highly arrogantly thinking it was an absolute, highly pathetic scam. But the highly specific address was completely, undeniably, real. The absolute tallest, most highly massive skyscraper entirely in the highly exclusive financial zone entirely of the massive city. Sarah got invited to a billionaire's will reading. Do you think she knows who Arturo Pineda really is? Let us know below. On highly anticipated Friday, Sarah flawlessly put completely on her absolute, only highly elegant, beautiful outfit. A highly simple, black designer dress she absolutely usually comfortably wore entirely for Diego's highly toxic, elite office parties, and actively took the highly crowded, cheap subway directly to the highly exclusive financial district. She profoundly felt incredibly, pathetically diminutive, confidently standing perfectly entirely in the highly massive, imported marble lobby entirely of the massive Pineda Tower. When she successfully reached the absolute highest, most elite top floor, the highly professional receptionist smoothly guided her directly into a highly massive, elite boardroom that was highly significantly larger than her absolute entire, highly pathetic apartment building. The highly panoramic, stunning view entirely of the massive city was completely, utterly breathtaking. And exactly there, peacefully sitting entirely at the highly massive, expensive mahogany table was officially Diego. He was loudly, highly arrogantly laughing, happily chatting completely with a highly severe-looking, massive man entirely in a highly bespoke suit. Vanessa was confidently, perfectly by his broadside, highly lazily scrolling completely through her expensive phone, visually looking incredibly bored. When Diego vividly saw Sarah, he violently choked completely on his highly expensive sparkling water. "What exactly the hell are you actively doing exactly here?" Diego fiercely demanded, violently standing completely up. "Did you highly toxically actively follow me, Sarah? This is officially a highly private, highly secure, legal meeting. I am actively, entirely about to successfully, flawlessly close the highly massive acquisition entirely of the massive century. Get the hell completely out completely before I highly aggressively call elite security." "I was highly officially invited," Sarah stated, highly confidently raising the highly official letter. Diego aggressively snatched it completely from her soft hand. "A highly pathetic fake. It absolutely has to fiercely be. Why exactly would the highly esteemed late Arturo Pineda highly officially actively invite a highly pathetic waitress completely to the highly exclusive reading entirely of his massive will? You highly likely absolutely do not even completely know exactly who he truly is." "I absolutely do not completely know," Sarah softly admitted incredibly quietly. "But they highly officially sent me exactly this." "Mr. Serrano, sit completely down," the highly severe elite lawyer firmly stated. This was officially Leo Torres, the highly elite, absolute executor entirely of the massive estate. He was incredibly young, perhaps entirely in his highly early 30s, completely with highly intense, piercing green eyes and a highly sharp jawline that could highly easily, smoothly cut highly thick glass. He intensely looked directly at Sarah, and his highly severe expression beautifully softened, highly imperceptibly. "Mrs. Sarah Jimenez is officially the highly esteemed guest entirely of absolute honor." "Guest entirely of absolute honor," Vanessa highly toxically mocked. "She absolutely receives a highly pathetic consolation prize, a highly cheap toaster." "Silence!" Leo violently ordered. The massive room violently grew completely freezing cold. Leo confidently pressed a highly technological button perfectly on the massive table. A highly massive, glowing screen smoothly descended completely from the highly high ceiling. Mr. Pineda highly intentionally recorded a highly personal video message exactly 2 short days, completely before his highly tragic passing. He highly specifically requested that it be highly officially actively played, absolutely only, exactly when, absolutely, all highly interested parties were completely, highly actively present. The massive screen brilliantly sprang completely to absolute life. Diego smoothly adjusted his highly expensive silk tie, visually looking incredibly, highly smug. "Here we confidently go. The highly crazy old man highly likely successfully left the massive company completely to the absolute highest, most massive bidder. That is officially M.E. Samuel." The highly clear image flawlessly resolved. It was an incredibly elegant older man, happily sitting entirely in a highly expensive leather chair. He was flawlessly, cleanly shaven, flawlessly wearing a highly bespoke suit that easily cost significantly more than a highly expensive luxury car. But the piercing eyes. Sarah violently gasped. "Arturo," she whispered incredibly softly. Diego visually looked highly completely confused. "Who?" On the massive screen, the massive multi-billionaire Arturo Pineda confidently spoke. His deep voice was incredibly strong, highly authoritative. but completely with a highly familiar, beautiful warmth. If you are actively watching exactly this, I have successfully passed completely on directly to the highly massive next great adventure, entirely to my highly dedicated board of directors. Thank you so incredibly much, entirely, for your highly loyal service. Entirely to the highly toxic vultures, highly aggressively attempting to actively buy my massive company. The highly clear camera flawlessly zoomed incredibly slightly in. Highly specifically, you, Diego Serrano. Diego proudly puffed completely out his broad chest. That is officially me. He profoundly knows me. I intimately know you incredibly well, Mr. Serrano. Arturo's highly clear video aggressively continued. I profoundly know you entirely, because I have absolutely been intensely observing you. I profoundly know that you are a highly toxic man who maliciously measures absolute value completely by the highly expensive price entirely of a highly pathetic watch. I profoundly know that you highly toxically treat your highly dedicated subordinates exactly like highly pathetic cattle. And I profoundly know exactly how you highly cruelly, violently treated your beautiful wife. Absolutely all the color completely violently drained entirely from Diego's handsome face. Vanessa completely, violently stopped actively chewing her bright gum. You explicitly see, Arturo aggressively continued. I genuinely believe that completely, before absolutely anyone, highly miraculously inherits massive power. They absolutely and highly flawlessly demonstrate that they successfully possess absolute humanity. During the highly agonizing, absolute last 6 massive months, I have highly intentionally, highly actively lived, completely on the highly dangerous, freezing streets entirely of this massive city, exactly as a highly complex social experiment. I desperately wanted to vividly see exactly who would highly generously actively help a highly exhausted man who successfully possessed absolutely nothing completely, to highly generously offer completely in highly equal exchange, on the massive screen. Arturo smoothly leaned completely forward. Exactly thousands entirely of highly arrogant people confidently walked completely past me, highly toxically spat completely on me. But exactly one highly beautiful person, exactly one beautiful person highly generously gave me her highly pathetic tips, beautifully gave me highly hot soup, intensely listened completely to me exactly when I was completely invisible, fiercely defended me exactly when highly toxic others highly aggressively wanted to violently throw me completely into the highly dangerous gutter. Arturo beautifully smiled, and it was exactly the exact same, highly warm smile he beautifully gave completely to Sarah perfectly over the highly hot bowl entirely of delicious stew. Entirely to my highly loyal nephew, I highly generously leave my highly massive collection entirely of expensive vintage cars. Entirely to my highly dedicated charities, I highly generously leave exactly 10% entirely of my highly massive liquid assets. And the absolute rest, my highly absolute majority stake entirely in massive Pineda Industries, my highly massive global real estate portfolio, the highly sprawling elite estate entirely in beautiful Marbella, and my highly secure private bank accounts, completely totaling highly approximately exactly 4.2 billion euros. The massive room was so incredibly, highly deafeningly silent that you could highly easily clearly hear a fragile heart completely, violently break. I highly generously leave it absolutely all completely to Sarah Jimenez, entirely because she was the absolute only beautiful person who highly beautifully treated old Arturo exactly like a highly true, genuine human being. The massive screen violently went completely pitch black. Sarah just inherited 4.2 billion euros. Do you think Arturo's social experiment was fair? Let us know your thoughts. The new CEO for exactly 10 highly agonizing seconds. Absolutely no one physically moved a single inch. Then, Diego violently jumped completely up, aggressively throwing his heavy chair completely to the hard floor. This is an absolute, highly pathetic joke. She is a highly pathetic waitress. She highly pathetically served him cheap soup. You absolutely cannot highly legally generously give a multi-billion euro massive company completely to a highly pathetic waitress. Leo Torres confidently stood completely up, meticulously gathering a highly thick, heavy pile entirely of official legal documents. He confidently walked directly toward Sarah, completely, utterly ignoring the highly explosive Diego, absolutely entirely. It is absolutely no highly pathetic joke, Mr. Serrano, Leo stated completely, with a highly freezing coldness. He gently placed the highly thick documents flawlessly perfectly in front, entirely of a highly stunned, completely paralyzed Sarah. Mrs. Jimenez, or absolutely should I highly respectfully explicitly say, Madam CEO, we officially possess a highly massive amount entirely of highly important work to aggressively do. And the absolute first highly critical item entirely on the highly packed agenda actively involves the highly pending, massive contract completely with the highly toxic firm entirely of Mr. Serrano. Leo smoothly turned directly toward Diego. A highly small, incredibly satisfying smile, highly playfully dancing completely on his handsome lips. Sarah, Leo softly asked, completely with a highly low, incredibly respectful voice. Mr. Serrano is currently highly actively standing perfectly in the massive lobby, entirely of your highly massive building, highly pathetically begging to aggressively buy your massive company. Would you highly possibly fiercely like to successfully proceed completely with the massive deal? Sarah intensely looked directly at Diego. He was violently, profusely sweating, his piercing eyes frantically darting completely with pure, unadulterated panic. He intensely looked directly at Vanessa, who was intensely looking directly at Sarah completely, with highly gaping, absolute, pure jealousy. Sarah incredibly slowly, highly confidently, stood completely up. The blinding fear was completely, permanently gone. Entirely in its highly powerful place was a highly cold, fiercely burning absolute comprehension, entirely, of massive power. No, Sarah stated incredibly clearly, I highly genuinely think I absolutely do not desperately want to. The highly heavy silence that violently followed Sarah's absolute, massive rejection, entirely of Diego's highly lucrative deal, was brutally broken completely by the highly sharp, loud sound entirely of Leo Torres aggressively snapping the highly expensive leather portfolio completely shut. You have absolutely already clearly heard the highly powerful lady, Leo stated, his deep voice exactly like solid granite. Mr. Serrano, your highly pathetic proposal has officially been completely, violently denied. Highly elite security will highly aggressively successfully escort you and your highly toxic partner completely out, entirely of the massive building. Diego visually looked exactly as if he had literally just been brutally struck completely by highly lethal lightning. His highly perfect fake tan physically seemed to completely, violently fade, completely, into a highly sickly, terrifying gray. Sarah, Wait! You absolutely do not profoundly know exactly what you are highly actively doing. This is highly complex, elite business. You are absolutely just a highly pathetic waitress. You absolutely cannot highly successfully direct a massive empire. You highly desperately need me. Leo aggressively interposed himself completely in front, entirely of Sarah. Flawlessly, violently, blocking Diego's highly toxic view. He absolutely did not explicitly say a single heavy word. He simply intensely stared directly at Diego completely, with those highly piercing, intense green eyes. Completely. Until Diego involuntarily took exactly one highly cowardly step completely backward. Vanessa aggressively pulled completely on Diego's broad arm. Diego, let's aggressively go. Absolutely everyone is intensely staring directly at us. This highly pathetic place aggressively smells exactly like highly pathetic old people, absolutely anyway. Exactly two highly corpulent, massive security guards flawlessly materialized, completely out of absolute nowhere. Diego, highly pathetically babbling and completely bright red-faced, was practically, violently, highly aggressively dragged, completely to the highly secure elevator, completely with Vanessa perfectly directly behind him, highly toxically complaining highly loudly, entirely about her highly uncomfortable heels. When the highly golden elevator doors smoothly closed completely with a highly soft chime, Sarah's weak knees completely, violently, gave completely out. She frantically grabbed the hard edge entirely of the massive mahogany table, entirely to absolutely not violently fall completely down. The massive, blinding adrenaline violently plummeted, flawlessly replaced completely by a highly massive wave, entirely of pure panic. Oh my absolute God! What exactly did I literally just actively do, Leo? I absolutely cannot successfully do exactly this. Diego was 100% absolutely right. I successfully serve highly cheap coffee. I absolutely do not successfully direct multi-billion euro massive corporations. Arturo completely, catastrophically committed a highly massive mistake. Leo gently took her soft arm incredibly softly and beautifully guided her directly to the highly luxurious, expensive leather chair that Diego had highly pathetically left completely empty. He smoothly poured her a highly fresh glass, entirely of cold water, completely from a highly expensive crystal pitcher. Arturo Pineda absolutely never, ever committed highly pathetic mistakes, Sarah, Leo stated incredibly softly. Gracefully kneeling perfectly, next completely to her massive chair, entirely so exactly as absolutely not to highly imposingly tower completely over her. He was officially the absolute most highly astute judge, entirely of true character, I have absolutely ever miraculously known. He intensely observed you entirely for exactly 6 agonizing months. He vividly saw absolutely something highly massive, entirely in you, that this absolute, entire, highly massive city completely violently lacks. Absolute integrity. Absolute integrity absolutely does not highly intelligently read highly complex spreadsheets, Sarah murmured softly, completely into the cold glass. That is exactly what I am officially perfectly here entirely for, Leo stated firmly. I was officially the highly trusted right hand entirely of Arturo, completely, for exactly 10 agonizing years. Exactly now. I am officially yours, if you highly generously accept me. Sarah intensely looked directly at him. He was devastatingly, incredibly handsome, yes, but significantly more than exactly that. He visually seemed incredibly solid, highly reliable. The absolute total opposite entirely of Diego. "Okay," she whispered incredibly softly. "Where exactly do we aggressively begin? Absolutely first." Leo confidently stood completely up, a highly small, beautiful smile, highly gently touching his handsome lips. "We highly rapidly successfully get you completely out, entirely of that highly cheap cafeteria uniform. You officially possess a highly massive, critical board of directors meeting entirely in exactly 2 short hours. Sarah just fired Diego and took control of the company. Do you think she can run a billion-euro empire? Tell us below." The Cinderella CEO. The absolute rest entirely of the highly chaotic afternoon was an absolute, highly terrifying blur entirely of massive luxury. Leo highly rapidly successfully whisked her completely away, entirely in a highly massive, black corporate limousine that visually looked significantly longer than her absolute entire, highly pathetic apartment building. They confidently went directly to a highly exclusive, private boutique, exactly where highly polite assistants, who spoke entirely in highly hushed, quiet tones, flawlessly wrapped her completely in highly expensive fabrics that she absolutely did not completely know, highly miraculously existed. When she confidently stepped completely out entirely of the highly luxurious fitting room, flawlessly wearing a highly bespoke, navy blue power suit that easily cost significantly more than her cheap car, she literally barely vividly recognized herself completely in the massive mirror. Her highly exhausted eyes visually seemed significantly sharper. Her highly fragile posture aggressively straightened, but the highly expensive clothes were absolutely just a highly protective armor. And completely underneath, she was absolutely still, completely, utterly terrified. The massive boardroom was incredibly intimidating. Exactly 12 highly imposing older men, absolutely all flawlessly wearing highly expensive dark gray suits, peacefully sitting completely around the massive table. They intensely looked directly at her completely, with a highly complex mixture entirely of massive curiosity and highly poorly disguised toxic disdain. They were highly predatory wolves, highly anxiously waiting entirely for the highly innocent lamb to violently stumble. "Gentlemen," Leo confidently announced, confidently entering perfectly directly behind her. "Generously permit me to highly officially introduce your highly esteemed new CEO and absolute president, entirely of the massive board, Mrs. Sarah Jimenez." There was highly polite, incredibly scattered, weak applause. Exactly one highly arrogant man, completely with highly slicked-back silver hair and highly terrifying eyes, exactly like a lethal shark, absolutely did not highly politely applaud. This was officially Marcos Calvo, the highly ruthless chief financial officer, who had highly toxically expected entirely to violently successfully take absolute control exactly when Arturo tragically died. "Mrs. Jimenez," Marcos stated incredibly softly, his toxic voice heavily dripping completely with highly toxic condescension. "A highly tragic, massive day. We are absolutely all completely in massive shock right exactly now. We were actively entirely in the absolute middle, entirely of highly aggressively discussing the massive layoffs entirely in the Zaragoza factory, completely before this highly unexpected interruption. We desperately need to highly urgently, ruthlessly cut exactly 100 highly loyal jobs, entirely to aggressively increase the massive profits, entirely for this highly critical quarter, entirely for the massive shareholders." He highly aggressively slid a highly complex, confusing chart completely across the polished table directly toward her, highly toxically enjoying the highly visible panic that brilliantly flashed entirely in her beautiful eyes. He was highly actively attempting to highly publicly humiliate her, completely instantaneously. Sarah intensely looked directly at the highly complex chart. It explicitly meant absolutely nothing completely to her. The highly complex lines and massive numbers violently swam completely before her terrified eyes. She physically felt thick sweat aggressively running completely down her fragile back. The highly toxic voice entirely of Diego violently echoed entirely in her brilliant head. "You are absolutely pathetic garbage, Sarah." She physically felt Leo violently tense completely up, perfectly by her side. He was actively about to highly smoothly intervene entirely to miraculously save her. No, Sarah fiercely thought. Arturo highly generously left exactly this completely to me. Absolutely not completely to Leo. She aggressively pushed the highly complex chart completely back. "I absolutely do not completely understand exactly this highly complex chart, Mr. Calvo." A highly few toxic snickers loudly resonated completely around the massive table. Marco smiled highly smugly. "Well, exactly as I highly accurately anticipated. But I profoundly understand highly innocent people," Sarah violently interrupted, her beautiful voice violently trembling incredibly slightly, but highly rapidly aggressively gaining massive strength. "You desperately want to highly ruthlessly fire exactly 100 highly loyal families? Why exactly? Simply to highly artificially, aggressively make exactly one highly pathetic line entirely on a highly complex chart, slightly go highly pathetically up. It is highly standard, elite corporate practice," Marco stated completely with highly toxic disdain. Sarah deeply thought entirely about Arturo, violently trembling entirely in the highly freezing booth. She deeply thought entirely about the highly exhausted single mothers she brutally worked completely with, entirely, in the highly cheap cafeteria. Absolutely terrified entirely of violently losing exactly one highly critical shift. Arturo highly explicitly told the entire massive world that he highly profoundly valued absolute humanity, completely above highly toxic profit, Sarah stated, confidently, standing completely up. The massive room violently went, completely, utterly silent. "If we highly ruthlessly fire those highly loyal people, absolutely. Just to highly artificially make a highly pathetic line entirely on a highly complex chart, slightly go up. We are highly toxically, violently spitting completely on his massive legacy. Highly aggressively. Find absolutely another highly efficient way, entirely, to successfully save massive money. The Zaragoza factory completely, permanently remains highly open. That is officially my absolute first highly massive directive." Marcos violently turned bright purple. "You absolutely cannot simply. This is highly absurd. You are actively being highly emotional. This is absolute total incompetence. This is officially my massive company, Marcos," Sarah stated completely flatly, flawlessly channeling a highly massive authority that she absolutely did not completely know she successfully possessed. Leo highly smoothly actively moved directly to the absolute next highly critical point. Marcos leaned heavily completely back, violently fuming, his piercing eyes highly toxically fiercely promising absolute revenge. Leo intensely looked directly at Sarah completely with a highly brand new, beautiful expression. Highly undisguised, absolute awe. She had successfully survived the absolute first highly critical round, but she profoundly knew that the highly explosive war had absolutely only just aggressively begun. Sarah refused to fire 100 people. Do you think she made the right choice as a CEO? Tell us your thoughts below. The fallen husband. Exactly 3 agonizing weeks, significantly later. Diego Serrano was peacefully sitting entirely in a highly small, incredibly highly depressing, sordid apartment that was significantly, infinitely worse than the highly luxurious penthouse, completely from which he violently threw Sarah completely out. His highly secure, massive deal completely with Pineda had completely, violently evaporated, and completely with it, his highly massive, multi-million-dollar promotion bonus. He was actively, violently losing massive money completely in highly massive buckets. Vanessa was currently highly actively loudly screaming completely at him, completely from the highly tiny bedroom entirely, because her highly expensive credit card had literally just been violently declined entirely at Sephora. He aggressively turned completely on the cheap television, highly desperately drinking a highly cheap, pathetic whiskey. The highly prominent evening news was actively on. And exactly tonight is officially the highly exclusive, massive annual Pineda Charity Gala, the absolute most highly exclusive elite event entirely of the massive season. Absolutely all highly critical eyes are completely violently fixed entirely on the highly mysterious, brand new heiress, Sarah Jimenez, the highly pathetic former waitress who miraculously inherited the absolute entire, massive empire exactly last month. Highly critical critics highly toxically, explicitly call her the highly pathetic Cinderella CEO. Entirely, while massive Wall Street highly anxiously completely holds its highly critical breath entirely to vividly see exactly if she violently crashes and catastrophically burns. The bright screen highly flawlessly showed highly live images entirely of the highly exclusive red carpet, perfectly in front entirely of the highly majestic Royal Theater. Highly expensive limousines confidently arrived, flawlessly depositing the absolute highest elite entirely of the massive city. Diego intensely stared directly at the bright screen. A highly toxic, highly explosive mixture, entirely of absolute, white-hot rage and massive regret, violently boiling completely in his heavy stomach. Exactly that, absolutely, should have fiercely been him. Exactly that, massive power. Exactly that, massive money. Absolutely, all entirely of it was officially hers. The highly pathetic woman he arrogantly used to highly toxically, fiercely give strict orders completely to was exactly now the absolute most highly powerful person entirely in the massive city. "Vanessa!" Diego violently yelled. "Rapidly, actively dress completely up. We are actively going completely out." "Where exactly? We are completely, utterly ruined." "Diego, we are actively going directly to exactly that highly massive gala. I am actively going to miraculously fix absolutely all of this." Diego absolutely still successfully possessed his highly toxic, elite contacts. He highly aggressively, actively asked entirely for a highly massive favor, completely from a highly sleazy, toxic PR guy he intimately knew, and highly successfully managed entirely to highly miraculously actively get exactly 2 highly exclusive, last-minute VIP tickets, originally highly specifically destined entirely for a highly pathetic, second-rate celebrity who highly conveniently, violently caught the terrible flu. When Diego and a highly moody, complaining Vanessa confidently arrived completely at the highly majestic theater. The heavy air aggressively smelled entirely of expensive perfume and massive desperation. The highly aggressive photographers seamlessly lined the highly exclusive red carpet, their highly blinding flashes completely blinding. And then, the highly grand entrance lobby completely violently went absolutely silent. At the absolute top entirely of the highly grand, sweeping staircase was officially Sarah. She flawlessly wore a highly bespoke, highly customized Versace designer gown. A highly stunning, brilliant cascade, entirely of deep emerald silk, that beautifully flawlessly made her piercing eyes brilliantly pop. Perfectly completely around her elegant neck was officially the highly famous Pineda diamond, a highly priceless, massive family heirloom that Arturo's highly elegant mother absolutely always used to proudly wear. Her beautiful hair, highly previously absolutely always highly messily tied, completely in a highly messy bun, was flawlessly styled entirely in highly elegant, perfect waves. She absolutely did not visually look exactly like a highly pathetic waitress playfully actively playing highly cheap dress-up. She visually looked exactly like an absolute, untouchable queen, meticulously inspecting her massive kingdom. Perfectly on her soft arm was officially Leo Torres. Visually looking absolutely devastatingly handsome, entirely in a highly bespoke tuxedo. The highly protective, absolute reverence, completely with which he intensely looked directly at her, actively made Diego violently, desperately want to violently vomit. "Oh my absolute God," Vanessa whispered incredibly softly, genuinely, highly, deeply impressed. "That is officially Sarah." Diego absolutely did not actively respond. He simply aggressively began to confidently climb the massive stairs, highly, aggressively, actively pushing completely past highly powerful senators and massive oil magnates. He absolutely had to successfully reach her. He absolutely had to highly aggressively successfully remind her exactly who she truly was, exactly who they absolutely were. Sarah was actively entirely in the absolute middle, entirely of a highly polite conversation, completely with the highly powerful mayor, exactly when she physically felt a highly gentle tap, completely on her fragile shoulder. "Sarah, you visually look absolutely incredible." She smoothly turned completely around. When she vividly saw Diego, her heavy stomach violently tightened. It was a highly, deeply ingrained reflex. Agonizing years entirely of highly toxic conditioning, entirely to violently fear his highly toxic disapproval. But then, she physically felt the highly heavy weight entirely of the massive diamond completely around her elegant neck. She physically felt Leo confidently, smoothly approach perfectly to her strong back. "Diego," she stated completely with a highly freezing coldness, "I absolutely did not genuinely think you were officially entirely on the highly exclusive guest list. The highly elite tickets explicitly cost exactly 25,000 euros absolutely each. I highly genuinely hope you absolutely did not highly dangerously overextend completely yourself." Diego violently grimaced. "Sarah, please, can we actively talk completely in highly private, entirely for absolutely just exactly one highly brief minute? Entirely for the highly beautiful old times?" Leo confidently took exactly one massive step completely forward. "Mrs. Jimenez is incredibly busy, Mr. Serrano." "It is perfectly fine, Leo," Sarah stated incredibly softly, gently, highly confidently, raising exactly one soft hand. She intensely looked directly at Diego, genuinely, truly looked entirely at him. He visually looked incredibly tired. His highly expensive suit was highly messily wrinkled. The highly toxic arrogance entirely in his piercing eyes was completely, flawlessly replaced completely by a highly frantic, desperate, starving panic. He arrogantly used to visually appear exactly like an absolute god, completely to her. Exactly now. He absolutely only visually appeared highly pathetically small. Exactly 5 short minutes, Diego, entirely on the highly private balcony. They smoothly stepped completely out directly onto the highly beautiful stone balcony, perfectly overlooking the highly massive Plaza de Oriente. The freezing night air was incredibly crisp. "Sarah," I violently messed completely up, Diego actively began, frantically running exactly one highly sweating hand completely through his dark hair. He highly aggressively actively turned completely on the highly toxic charm. The exact same highly rehearsed fake smile that had actively made her fiercely fall, completely in pure love, completely with him exactly 10 agonizing years completely ago. I was an absolute, highly pathetic idiot. I highly let completely myself, highly toxically, actively, get completely violently carried completely away entirely by the highly massive stress entirely of grueling work. And Vanessa, she was absolutely just a highly pathetic distraction. A highly pathetic midlife crisis. Sarah absolutely said nothing, her beautiful face completely, utterly unreadable. He slowly approached significantly closer, gently, actively reaching entirely for her soft hands. She generously let him highly confidently, actively take them. His highly sweating palms were incredibly clammy. I deeply missed us, Sarah. We were an absolute, highly flawless team. Profoundly, remember? You and I completely against the entire, massive world. I can actively help you. You are actively, violently drowning entirely in exactly this. I profoundly know exactly that you absolutely are. Generously, let me confidently come completely back. Generously, let me actively help you successfully direct the massive company. We can highly successfully be the absolute, ultimate power couple entirely of the massive century. I absolutely still fiercely love you, baby. He smoothly leaned completely in entirely to highly passionately kiss her. It would highly possibly be so incredibly, pathetically easy. It was highly familiar. It was the highly pathetic apology she had beautifully dreamed entirely of, entirely, for agonizing months. Sarah violently withdrew her soft hands incredibly highly abruptly. You absolutely do not fiercely love me, Diego, she stated incredibly softly. Her beautiful voice completely, utterly devoid, entirely of absolutely any emotion. You fiercely love the highly expensive emerald dress. You fiercely love the massive diamond necklace. You fiercely love the exactly 4 billion euros. That is absolutely not completely true. It absolutely is, she stated incredibly firmly. When I flawlessly wore a highly cheap apron and aggressively smelled exactly like highly disgusting cafeteria grease, I was highly pathetic garbage that you desperately needed to violently throw completely out. Exactly now that I officially possess the highly massive money entirely of Arturo, I am highly suddenly your highly pathetic baby, completely again. You are completely, utterly pathetic. Diego's highly toxic mask completely, violently slipped. The highly fake charm completely vanished. Flawlessly replaced completely by the highly cruel, toxic mockery that she profoundly knew way too incredibly well. Do absolutely not highly arrogantly, actively get completely high and mighty completely with me, Sarah. You are an absolute, highly pathetic fraud. You are actively going to completely violently sink this massive company entirely in exactly 6 short months. And exactly when you absolutely do, I will absolutely be perfectly there, entirely, to highly toxically. Get the hell completely out entirely of my absolute sight, Diego, Sarah violently whispered, smoothly turning completely around entirely to intensely look completely at the bright city lights. Completely before I highly aggressively, highly actively make elite security violently throw you completely down the massive stairs. This highly specific time, Diego violently stormed completely back, entirely inside, highly furious. Sarah took a highly massive, violently trembling deep breath, frantically holding completely back the hot tears. It violently hurt. It absolutely still violently hurt to vividly see the exact man she fiercely loved completely, violently actively turn completely into a highly toxic monster. Leo confidently appeared perfectly in the heavy doorway, gently, fiercely holding exactly 2 highly expensive crystal glasses entirely of vintage champagne. He absolutely did not explicitly ask exactly what violently happened. He simply gently handed her exactly 1 expensive glass. You flawlessly did incredibly well, he stated incredibly softly. Sarah gently clinked her expensive glass completely against his. I genuinely think I absolutely hate vintage champagne. She successfully managed a highly weak, beautiful smile. We can highly easily actively get a highly delicious cheap burger completely after exactly this, Leo fiercely promised. I absolutely actively highly generously treat. Sarah finally smiled completely genuinely. Entirely for the absolute first time entirely, in exactly what highly painfully felt exactly like agonizing years. She absolutely did not profoundly feel completely alone. Meanwhile, completely across the highly crowded ballroom, Diego was highly aggressively actively drinking his highly massive 4th expensive scotch entirely at the highly open bar. A highly dark shadow violently fell completely over him. It was Marcos Calvo, the highly toxic chief financial officer completely with highly terrifying shark eyes, who violently hated Sarah. Highly difficult night, Mr. Serrano, Marcos highly toxically murmured, smoothly swirling his absolute own expensive drink. What exactly the hell do you fiercely want? Diego violently glared directly at him. I vividly saw your highly pathetic little reunion entirely on the highly private balcony, Marcos stated incredibly astutely. It highly apparently seems that we absolutely both successfully possess a highly massive problem completely with the brand new elite management. She is completely incompetent, highly emotional. She is actively going to completely ruin absolutely everything that Arturo highly meticulously built. Marco smoothly leaned incredibly close, his toxic voice a highly slithering, highly toxic whisper. You profoundly know her highly pathetic weaknesses, Diego. You profoundly know exactly where the highly pathetic corpses are completely buried entirely in her highly toxic past. I intimately know the massive company. If we brutally work completely together, we can highly publicly expose her entirely for the highly pathetic fraud she absolutely is. We can completely violently take absolutely everything completely away entirely from her. Diego intensely looked directly at Marcos, then intensely looked completely across the massive room directly at Sarah, happily laughing entirely at absolutely something highly amusing Leo was actively saying. The highly blinding flashes entirely of the paparazzi cameras flawlessly illuminating her pure joy. Highly toxic envy violently burned entirely in his heavy chest, exactly like highly lethal acid. "I am actively listening," Diego stated. "Diego and Marcos are plotting against Sarah. What do you think they're going to do? Drop your predictions below." The frame-up for exactly 2 highly beautiful months, highly complex things, visually seemed to actively go completely, highly impossibly well, completely under the highly compassionate, people-first elite leadership, entirely of Sarah. Pineda Industries was absolutely not entirely just miraculously surviving, but highly aggressively thriving. Highly public perception had completely, beautifully shifted. The highly famous Cinderella CEO was exactly now the absolute, highly adored darling entirely of the massive media. The highly critical Zaragoza factory, which she highly bravely saved, had miraculously doubled its highly efficient production completely out entirely of pure, absolute loyalty directly toward her. Sarah was peacefully sitting entirely in her massive office, meticulously signing highly official papers. She profoundly felt incredibly confident. She intensely looked directly at the highly empty chair perfectly in front, entirely of her, exactly where Leo absolutely usually highly comfortably sat. He was currently highly actively entirely in massive London, aggressively negotiating a highly complex merger. She deeply missed him significantly more than she desperately wanted to highly bravely admit. Her highly efficient secretary, a highly kind woman explicitly named Marta, highly urgently called completely over the highly secure intercom. "Mrs. Jimenez, the massive board has highly urgently convened a highly unexpected emergency meeting. They explicitly state it is incredibly, highly urgent." Sarah deeply frowned. "I absolutely did not highly urgently convene absolutely any massive meeting. It was highly aggressively convened completely by Mr. Calvo." Sarah's heavy stomach completely plummeted. She aggressively grabbed her heavy notebook and confidently headed directly straight, completely to the massive boardroom. When she confidently entered, the highly tense atmosphere was completely suffocating. The highly heavy blinds were completely drawn. The exactly 12 highly powerful members, entirely of the massive board, intensely stared directly at her, entirely in a highly sepulchral, dead silence. At the absolute head entirely of the massive table was officially Marcos Calvo, and confidently standing perfectly right, perfectly next, completely to him, visually looking significantly more incredibly smug than a highly toxic cat, completely with a highly innocent canary, was officially Diego Serrano. "What exactly the hell is he actively doing exactly here?" Sarah violently demanded, confidently remaining highly proudly standing. "He is absolutely not a highly official employee, and he is strictly legally highly banned completely from confidently entering the massive building. Mr. Serrano is officially right here exactly as a highly crucial material witness," Marcos stated. His toxic voice exactly as incredibly smooth, exactly as cheap oil. He highly aggressively slid a highly thick black folder completely across the polished table. "Sarah, we have highly officially received highly disturbing, highly damning evidence, entirely about the highly absolute validity, entirely of the highly official last will and massive testament, entirely of Arturo Pineda." Sarah laughed highly nervously. The massive will was legally, federally, probated agonizing months completely ago. It is completely, absolutely ironclad. "Absolutely not exactly, if it was highly illegally coerced," Diego violently interrupted. He confidently walked completely around the massive table, highly toxically enjoying the highly massive spotlight. You vividly see people more. Highly esteemed ladies and highly powerful gentlemen entirely of the massive board. I was highly legally married completely to Sarah, entirely for exactly 7 agonizing years. I intimately know her highly pathetic handwriting. I intimately know her highly toxic tricks, and I profoundly know that she highly intimately met Arturo significantly, infinitely earlier than she highly falsely actively claims. Diego aggressively pulled a highly thick pile entirely of highly glossy photos, completely from the deep pocket, entirely of his highly expensive jacket, and violently threw them completely onto the polished table. They were highly grainy, completely heavily photoshopped, highly fake images that visually appeared to highly falsely show Sarah violently arguing completely with Arturo entirely in a highly dark alley, visually looking highly aggressive and incredibly threatening. These highly toxic photos highly strongly suggest that you were highly maliciously actively stalking Mr. Pineda, Marcos aggressively added. And we officially possess a highly sworn witness statement, completely from a highly specific Vanessa Miller, highly falsely alleging that she clearly heard you highly toxically bragging entirely about actively forcing the highly sick old man entirely to highly illegally sign the massive papers entirely while he was violently delirious, completely with a highly severe fever.
That is an absolute toxic lie!
Sarah violently screamed, aggressively slamming her soft hand completely on the hard table.
Vanessa is his highly toxic girlfriend. She would explicitly say absolutely anything he highly aggressively explicitly tells her to highly toxically say.
And then there is absolutely also the highly massive matter entirely of the highly illegal embezzlement, Marcos violently interrupted. Aggressively raising his deep voice, he highly aggressively clicked a highly advanced remote control, and the massive screen perfectly behind him brilliantly sprang completely to absolute life. It highly clearly showed highly complex bank transfers, actively, highly illegally, moving exactly millions entirely of massive euros, completely from the highly secure Pineda Charitable Fund, directly to a highly mysterious, highly illegal offshore account entirely in the massive Cayman Islands. The highly specific name entirely of the highly secure account, S.J. Holdings.
I absolutely did not highly illegally actively move exactly that massive money,
Sarah violently gasped. The massive room aggressively began to violently spin. The highly official transfer authorization completely, highly undeniably, came completely from your highly secure corporate computer, actively using your highly secure private password at exactly 2 a.m., completely at midnight, Marcos stated, highly mockingly shaking his silver head, completely with highly fake, toxic sadness. We legally possess the highly undeniable, complex computer logs. It highly apparently seems that the highly massive pressure entirely of the elite job completely violently overcame you, Sarah. You desperately wanted a highly massive golden parachute completely before the massive company horrifyingly realized exactly that you were completely, utterly incompetent. Diego highly maliciously stole my private passwords. Sarah fiercely pointed completely with a violently trembling finger directly at her highly toxic ex-husband. He intimately knows my highly old passwords. He highly successfully guessed them. I absolutely have not vividly seen you entirely in agonizing months, Sarah. Diego smoothly, completely lied. Intensely looking directly at the highly powerful board members, completely with highly massive, highly innocent, fake eyes. I am absolutely only perfectly here, entirely to actively do the absolute right noble thing. Arturo Pineda was an absolute, highly respected titan. He absolutely should not be highly maliciously defrauded completely by my highly pathetic ex-wife. Marcos confidently stood completely up. Sarah Jimenez, completely pending a highly official, massive federal investigation. The massive board highly legally invokes highly strict Article 50s. You are officially completely suspended, highly, immediately, exactly as massive CEO. Elite security will highly aggressively successfully escort you completely out. You absolutely cannot legally actively do exactly this. Leo will violently stop it. Mr. Torres is actively in massive London. Marcos highly toxically mocked. And exactly by the highly precise time he confidently returns, the elite police will absolutely already successfully possess you completely under highly strict federal custody. Exactly 2 massive security guards, completely brand new, massive men that Sarah absolutely did not vividly recognize, aggressively grabbed her soft arms. "Let me completely go!" Sarah violently screamed. She fiercely caught the highly toxic gaze entirely of Diego, exactly one absolute last, highly terrifying time, exactly as they aggressively dragged her completely away. He absolutely was not happily smiling completely anymore. He was highly silently, toxically, actively mouthing exactly one single, highly toxic heavy word: karma. Diego and Marcos framed Sarah for embezzlement. Do you think she can prove her innocence before she gets arrested? Tell us below! The dead man's switch, violently thrown completely out directly onto the freezing sidewalk, completely under the highly torrential freezing rain. Violently stripped completely of her massive company, her pristine reputation, and her absolute dignity. Sarah was completely, utterly, left entirely alone. The highly aggressive paparazzi were absolutely already completely there. Highly maliciously tipped completely off entirely by Marcos. The highly blinding flashes violently exploded entirely in her pale face, exactly like highly lethal lightning. Sarah, did you highly illegally maliciously rob the massive money? Sarah, did you highly maliciously falsify the massive will? She frantically covered her highly pale face and violently ran. She absolutely did not actively go directly to her highly luxurious luxury apartment. She frantically ran directly to the highly crowded subway. She frantically ran directly completely back, entirely to the absolute, only highly specific place that profoundly felt incredibly real. She frantically ran completely back directly to the highly dark alley, perfectly behind the highly dilapidated corner cafeteria. The freezing rain entirely in the massive city absolutely did not magically clean highly toxic things. It absolutely only highly aggressively actively made the highly disgusting dirt significantly more incredibly slippery. Sarah sat heavily, entirely, on a highly cheap plastic milk crate, entirely in the highly dark alley, perfectly behind the highly busy cafeteria. It was the highly exact, highly specific spot, exactly where she had highly miraculously successfully found Arturo, violently trembling exactly 3 agonizing months completely ago. The highly massive irony absolutely did not completely escape her. Entirely in highly actual fact, it physically felt exactly like a highly crushing, massive physical weight violently crushing her fragile chest. She flawlessly wore a highly expensive €3,000 bespoke suit that was exactly now completely, utterly ruined.
completely soaked entirely, with highly disgusting, muddy water, and aggressively smelling exactly like the highly toxic dumpster perfectly right beside her. Her beautiful hair, highly meticulously styled exactly that highly specific morning, completely by a highly famous celebrity hairstylist, was highly pathetically completely plastered directly to her pale skull. She frantically checked her expensive phone. It was violently exploding completely, with highly massive notifications. Cinderella CEO highly publicly escorted completely out in heavy handcuffs. Financial Times, massive embezzlement scandal, violently rocks the highly powerful Pineda empire. A highly toxic text message completely from Diego. I highly explicitly told you absolutely not to highly pathetically actively play completely with the highly massive big boys. She violently threw the expensive phone directly into a highly muddy puddle. It splashed loudly and violently went completely dark. I completely, catastrophically failed you, Arturo, she whispered incredibly softly, her beautiful voice violently cracking. The highly soft sound was completely swallowed entirely by the highly constant hum, entirely, of the massive city traffic. You highly generously gave me absolutely everything, and I highly pathetically generously let them violently take it absolutely all completely away. Diego was 100% absolutely right. I am absolutely just a highly pathetic waitress. I absolutely never, ever absolutely should have highly actively been an absolute queen. She fiercely hugged her freezing wet knees, highly desperately burying her pale face. She highly agonizingly patiently waited entirely for the highly absolute inevitable. The highly terrifying police sirens, the highly official arrest warrant, the highly absolute tragic end, entirely, of her massive life. You profoundly know. A highly deep, incredibly familiar voice violently cut completely through the highly constant sound entirely of the freezing rain. Arturo explicitly told me exactly once that the absolute, true measure entirely of a highly elite CEO is absolutely not exactly how they highly proudly, beautifully cut a highly ceremonial ribbon. It is exactly how they highly successfully, flawlessly handle the highly lethal knife perfectly in their broad back. Sarah's heavy head violently snapped completely up, standing perfectly entirely in the highly dark mouth, entirely of the dark alley, beautifully silhouetted, completely against the highly bright streetlights, was officially Leo Torres. He visually looked exactly like an absolute, highly chaotic disaster. His highly bespoke tie, absolutely usually highly impeccable, was completely, highly messily undone. His highly expensive trench coat was completely soaked, and he was highly heavily panting, exactly as if he had literally just frantically run exactly 10 highly agonizing city blocks. A highly massive black armored car was highly actively idling perfectly on the busy curb, completely with the heavy door completely wide open. But Leo was completely, utterly ignoring it. "Leo!" Sarah violently gasped, confidently standing completely up perfectly on violently trembling legs. "You are highly officially supposed to absolutely be entirely in massive London. The highly massive merger. To absolute hell completely with the highly massive merger," Leo violently growled, confidently walking directly toward her. He absolutely did not fiercely care a single bit entirely about the highly disgusting mud or the highly toxic smell. He confidently walked directly straight, completely toward her, and fiercely wrapped his strong hands completely around her weak arms, highly securely holding her incredibly steady. His piercing green eyes brilliantly shone completely with a highly terrifying intensity that she had absolutely never, ever
vividly seen completely before. I vividly saw the highly urgent alert entirely on the highly secure Bloomberg terminal. CEO highly publicly suspended, completely for massive fraud. I highly violently actively turned the highly expensive private jet completely around directly over the massive Atlantic. "It is absolutely true, Leo," Sarah violently sobbed. The highly massive fight completely draining entirely from her. Or entirely at absolute least. They highly successfully actively made it visually appear completely true. They successfully possess highly complex computer logs. They successfully possess highly illegal bank transfers. Diego, he profoundly knew my highly old private passwords. He and Marcos highly maliciously set an absolute lethal trap completely for me. I absolutely cannot, highly possibly successfully fight completely against them. They successfully possess the massive board, the elite police, the highly toxic press. I successfully possessed absolutely nothing. "You successfully possess me," Leo firmly stated. The highly heavy words were incredibly simple. But they violently struck Sarah completely with the highly massive force, entirely of a highly fast freight train. He smoothly released exactly one entirely of her soft arms, entirely to highly smoothly reach, completely into the highly deep inside pocket, entirely of his completely soaked coat. He aggressively pulled completely out a highly small, incredibly highly battered leather-bound notebook. It was highly tattered, highly securely held completely together, entirely by highly old, degraded rubber bands. The highly expensive leather heavily worn, completely down, entirely by agonizing decades entirely of highly constant use. Sarah deeply frowned, aggressively wiping the freezing water completely from her exhausted eyes. Is exactly that the highly secret diary entirely of Arturo? The exact specific one he absolutely always heavily carried, exactly when he was actively playing highly homeless? The highly exact same one, Leo smoothly confirmed. He highly securely gave it directly to me, the exact highly tragic night he tragically passed completely away. He actively made me fiercely swear absolutely never, ever, to actively open the highly secure, absolute back section, absolutely, unless the massive company was actively in highly mortal, catastrophic danger. I highly respectfully respected his highly absolute privacy. I highly genuinely thought he explicitly meant a highly hostile, massive corporate acquisition entirely by a highly ruthless rival company. Leo highly aggressively, violently, broke the highly secure wax seal perfectly on the highly secret back pages entirely of the small notebook. His strong hands violently trembled incredibly slightly. Absolutely not entirely from the freezing cold, but entirely from highly absolute, pure rage. Arturo absolutely did not highly blindly trust Marcos Calvo, Leo explicitly explained, rapidly scanning the highly complex handwritten pages completely under the highly dim light entirely of the dark alley. He profoundly knew that Marcos was highly illegally actively stealing completely from the absolute top, but he absolutely could not highly successfully prove it completely before he violently fell incredibly sick. And he profoundly knew that exactly if he highly generously left the massive company completely to absolutely anyone completely other than Marcos, Marcos would highly aggressively actively attempt to violently destroy them. Leo's piercing eyes completely stopped actively moving. He agonizingly read a highly specific passage, and then intensely looked directly at Sarah. A highly slow, incredibly terrifying, highly freezing smile, beautifully spread completely across his handsome face. It was the highly lethal smile, entirely of an absolute apex predator. Incredibly sharp and highly dangerous. "Oh, you highly brilliant, incredibly paranoid old fox," Leo whispered incredibly softly. "What exactly?" Sarah asked, cautiously approaching significantly closer. "What exactly does it explicitly say?" "It explicitly says," Leo intensely looked directly at her, his deep voice incredibly firm, "that we desperately need to confidently return directly to the massive tower. Right exactly now." "I absolutely cannot confidently return directly there. Elite security will violently, highly aggressively throw me completely out. The elite police are highly likely absolutely already completely there. Generously let them absolutely be completely there," Leo stated, gently taking her soft hand. His absolute grip was exactly like solid iron. "Sarah, intensely listen completely to me. You are absolutely not a highly pathetic waitress. You are officially Sarah Jimenez, the highly beautiful woman who highly bravely showed pure, unadulterated kindness exactly when absolutely no one completely else was intensely looking. Arturo absolutely did not fiercely choose you completely by pathetic accident. He fiercely chose you entirely because you officially possess the absolute, only massive thing that Marcos and Diego absolutely do not possess." "What exactly is that?" "Absolutely nothing highly massive to violently lose," Leo stated. "Now, confidently get directly into the massive armored car. We officially possess a highly toxic party entirely to completely, violently ruin." Leo and Sarah are heading back to the Pineda Tower. What do you think Arturo's secret notebook revealed? Drop your predictions below. The dead man's switch. Exactly 45 highly agonizing minutes significantly later. The highly tense atmosphere completely inside the highly exclusive executive suite entirely of the massive Pineda Tower was a highly raucous, highly toxic celebration. Marcos Calvo was peacefully sitting highly comfortably, entirely in the highly massive leather chair, perfectly behind the highly imposing CEO's desk. Sarah's massive desk. He highly arrogantly possessed his expensive shoes perfectly propped, completely up entirely on the highly polished mahogany surface, highly casually crossing his ankles. He securely held a highly expensive crystal glass, completely filled entirely with highly rare amber noir, a highly exclusive whiskey that easily cost exactly 4,000 euros, an absolute bottle, on the absolute other side entirely of the massive room. Diego Serrano was highly enthusiastically actively uncorking a highly expensive bottle entirely of elite vintage champagne. The highly expensive foam violently spilled completely over his massive hands, and he loudly laughed, highly toxically licking it highly pathetically completely off his fingers. "To the highly glorious new era!" Diego violently screamed, highly proudly raising the expensive bottle. "To the highly tragic, highly pathetic end entirely of the highly pathetic Cinderella story." Marcos smiled highly smugly, smoothly swirling his expensive drink. God, did you vividly see her highly pathetic face exactly when elite security violently grabbed her? I highly genuinely thought she was actively going to completely, violently pass completely out. "She is incredibly weak," Diego stated, confidently walking completely over to smoothly pour a highly full glass completely for Marcos. "She absolutely always was. I highly pathetically actively carried her entirely for exactly 7 agonizing years. You profoundly know? She absolutely wouldn't have absolutely been completely anything completely without me. And exactly now she is actively going directly to federal prison. Absolute, pure poetic justice. Are you absolutely 100% completely sure the elite police are absolutely already actively on their massive way? Marco softly asked. I literally just highly successfully received a highly secure message completely from my highly elite contact entirely in the highly secure precinct, Diego firmly confirmed, highly arrogantly checking his expensive phone. They are actively, highly officially issuing the highly strict warrant right exactly now. They will highly aggressively successfully pick her completely up, entirely at her highly pathetic apartment, or completely under absolutely whatever highly pathetic bridge she is actively peacefully sleeping completely under, entirely within exactly 1 short hour. Entirely for exactly tomorrow morning, Sarah Jimenez will highly pathetically actively exchange her highly expensive Versace completely for a highly cheap orange prison jumpsuit. And the highly illegal offshore accounts are completely, utterly untraceable, Marcos stated, completely, with highly massive confidence. The massive money she highly illegally stole is perfectly, completely safe, entirely in a highly secure shell company. Exactly once the highly intense heat beautifully dies completely down, we highly equally, completely divide it. Exactly 50-50, exactly flawlessly exactly as we meticulously planned. I fiercely love it exactly when a highly complex plan flawlessly comes completely together. Diego highly aggressively actively took a highly massive drink, entirely of the expensive champagne, directly completely from the heavy bottle. You profoundly know, I might highly actively actually aggressively buy that massive luxury penthouse completely back. It will absolutely be significantly sweeter, highly profoundly knowing that she highly pathetically lived perfectly there. You are an incredibly highly cruel man, Diego. Marcos loudly laughed. I fiercely like it. I flawlessly learned completely from the absolute best. Boom! The highly loud sound was exactly like a highly lethal gunshot. The highly massive mahogany double doors entirely of the massive office absolutely did not entirely just smoothly open. They were highly violently kicked, completely open, completely, with so incredibly much highly massive force that the highly expensive wood violently splintered completely around the highly secure lock. Marcos violently jumped so incredibly hard that he aggressively spilled highly expensive whiskey, absolutely all, completely over his highly expensive bespoke shirt. Diego completely, violently dropped the expensive champagne bottle. It violently shattered completely on the hard floor, aggressively sending highly sharp glass fragments completely flying entirely across the highly expensive Persian rug. Standing perfectly entirely in the heavy doorway was officially Sarah. She absolutely still flawlessly wore the highly wet, ruined suit. But she had highly aggressively pulled her wet hair completely back. Her highly expensive makeup was completely, permanently gone, flawlessly leaving her pale face completely bare, incredibly pale, and highly fierce. She absolutely did not visually look exactly like a highly pathetic victim. She visually looked exactly like a highly terrifying executioner. Directly behind her was officially Leo, fiercely holding the highly battered small notebook. And directly behind him were exactly 4 highly massive men, completely in incredibly dark suits, who were absolutely, definitively not the highly usual standard building security. You are highly illegally trespassing, Marcos violently screamed, confidently standing completely up. Get the hell out! Security! Where exactly the hell is elite security?
Your highly toxic security team has absolutely been highly officially completely relieved entirely of their highly pathetic duty, Leo stated incredibly calmly, confidently entering the massive room. These highly massive gentlemen are highly elite private contractors, and they absolutely do not highly respectfully answer completely to you. I am highly urgently actively calling the elite police, Diego violently screamed, his deep voice violently cracking. He frantically fumbled entirely for his expensive phone. You are completely finished, Sarah. You are officially a highly pathetic fugitive. Sarah confidently walked incredibly slowly directly into the massive room. She confidently stepped completely straight, directly over the violently broken glass and the highly expensive, spilled champagne. She absolutely did not explicitly say a single heavy word. She simply confidently walked directly completely up, entirely to the absolute front, entirely of the massive desk, and intensely stared directly at Marcos completely until he highly instinctively, violently, sat completely back down. Completely, utterly intimidated, completely, by the highly pure, massive voltage, entirely, of her absolute rage. Do you genuinely, arrogantly think you are incredibly smart, Marcos? Sarah stated. Her beautiful voice was incredibly low, completely devoid, entirely of the violently trembling fear, completely from the highly dark alley. Do you arrogantly think that simply entirely because you profoundly know the highly complex numbers, you profoundly know absolutely everything, but you completely, highly catastrophically forgot exactly one massive thing? This was officially Arturo's massive building. He flawlessly built it. He flawlessly wired it. He fiercely loved it. Arturo is completely dead, Marcos violently spat, desperately attempting to miraculously recover absolutely some highly pathetic courage. And you are officially a highly pathetic thief. Leo, Sarah violently ordered, absolutely without ever actively taking her piercing eyes completely off Marcos. Read the highly specific entry. Leo smoothly opened the small notebook directly to the absolute last heavy page. He loudly, aggressively, cleared his dry throat. Highly specific entry, highly officially dated exactly November 14th. Exactly 3 short days, completely before his highly tragic death. Leo loudly read, I have highly officially completely confirmed my highly terrifying suspicions. Marcos is actively highly illegally moving highly test deposits directly to the massive Caymans. He highly arrogantly thinks I am way too incredibly sick to actively notice. He is highly meticulously actively preparing an absolute, lethal trap entirely for exactly whoever highly successfully succeeds me. Therefore, I have highly officially activated the highly secure dead man switch protocol entirely in the highly massive office mainframe. Marcos's handsome face violently turned the exact, terrifying color entirely of highly spoiled milk. What? That is an absolute, highly pathetic myth. There is absolutely no highly actual such massive thing. Read the absolute rest, Leo, Sarah firmly stated. The highly secure protocol is an absolute, highly passive, massive listening system, Leo aggressively continued. It is highly seamlessly connected completely to the highly advanced smoke detectors and the highly complex visual sensors entirely in the highly massive teleconference screen. It flawlessly records absolutely all highly complex audio and highly clear video entirely in the massive CEO's office, securely stored completely on an absolute, independent massive cloud server. It highly seamlessly remains completely dormant, completely until it is highly officially activated completely by a highly specific absolute voice command. The massive room completely, violently, fell entirely into a highly deadly, absolute silence. The absolute only highly audible sound was the highly violent, freezing rain, aggressively lashing completely against the highly panoramic windows. And exactly what is the highly specific command? Marcos whispered incredibly softly, his piercing eyes frantically darting completely around the massive room. Sarah smoothly leaned completely over the massive desk, her beautiful face exactly a highly terrifying few short centimeters completely from Marcos's highly terrified, pale face. She beautifully smiled, but it absolutely did not successfully reach her freezing eyes. The highly specific command is scrapped entirely for cheap parts, as incredibly soon. Exactly as she explicitly said the highly heavy words. A highly sharp, loud electronic beep loudly resonated completely from the high ceiling. The highly massive screen, perfectly on the hard wall directly behind the massive desk, brilliantly sprang completely to absolute life. A highly robotic voice completely filled the massive room. System highly successfully activated. Aggressively uploading highly secure audio and video files entirely of the absolute last 24 hours directly to the SEC Compliance Division, the FBI Cyber Crimes Unit, and the National Elite Police. On the bright screen, a highly massive progress bar flawlessly appeared. "No!" Diego violently gasped. "No! No! No!" "It flawlessly recorded absolutely everything," Sarah stated, confidently straightening completely up. "It flawlessly recorded exactly how you highly arrogantly admitted entirely to the highly fake Photoshop. It flawlessly recorded exactly how you highly toxically bragged entirely about highly successfully guessing my highly secure passwords. It flawlessly recorded Marcos highly confidently talking entirely about the highly illegal shell company. It flawlessly recorded exactly how you highly greedily divided the stolen money." "Violently stop it!" Marcos loudly shrieked, aggressively slamming the expensive keyboard completely with his massive fist. "Violently delete it!" "It is absolutely already completely gone, Marcos," Leo stated, highly confidently checking his expensive watch, and highly accurately judging completely by the highly loud sirens I clearly hear completely down entirely below. The highly elite recipients have absolutely already successfully opened the highly explosive files. Diego intensely looked directly at Sarah. Absolute, pure panic had completely, violently consumed him. Absolutely entirely. He frantically looked directly at the heavy door, then directly at the massive window, exactly as if he were highly seriously actively contemplating violently jumping. Then, he aggressively lunged directly toward Sarah. "Sarah, wait! Intensely listen!" He frantically grabbed her soft hands, his highly sweating palms incredibly disgusting. He aggressively forced me entirely to actively do it. Marcos violently threatened me. He highly explicitly said he would violently ruin my entire career. You intimately know me, Sarah. You profoundly know I absolutely wouldn't actively do exactly this completely to you. I fiercely love you. We are officially married. Divorced, Sarah highly smoothly corrected, violently withdrawing her soft hands, exactly as if she had literally just actively touched a highly burning hot stove. We are officially permanently divorced, Diego. But I can miraculously fix exactly this, Diego pathetically babbled, hot tears violently running completely down his pale face. I can highly eagerly testify completely against him. I can absolutely be completely on your highly winning side. Simply explicitly tell them it was absolutely just a highly massive misunderstanding. Please, Sarah, I am incredibly sorry, entirely about the luxury apartment. I am incredibly sorry entirely about Vanessa. She explicitly meant absolutely nothing. You are officially the absolute love entirely of my entire life." Sarah intensely looked directly at him. Genuinely, truly looked entirely at him. For agonizing years, this highly toxic man had absolutely been her entire, massive world. She had brutally worked highly exhausting double shifts entirely to highly expensively buy him bespoke suits, exactly like the highly expensive one he was actively wearing. She had violently cried completely until she exhaustedly fell deeply asleep, highly agonizingly wondering exactly why she absolutely wasn't incredibly good enough entirely for him. Now, intensely seeing him highly pathetically beg, completely with highly disgusting snot actively running completely down his pale nose, highly actively willing to highly violently throw his elite partner completely under the massive bus, entirely to miraculously save his absolute own, highly pathetic skin. She profoundly felt absolutely nothing. Absolutely no toxic hatred. Absolutely no blinding anger. Absolutely only a highly profound, incredibly empty, absolute pity. "Do you profoundly know, Diego?" Sarah stated incredibly softly. "The absolute, highly saddest massive part, absolutely, isn't that you violently betrayed me. It is that you highly pathetically sold your absolute soul entirely for a highly fake, elite lifestyle that you absolutely never, ever truly earned. You absolutely are not a highly successful businessman. You are absolutely just a highly cheap, pathetic suit, completely with absolutely nothing, highly real, completely inside." The highly golden elevator doors loudly chimed. A highly massive squad, entirely of elite police officers, flawlessly led, completely by the highly imposing police commissioner himself, violently burst completely into the massive room. "Marcos Calvo, Diego Serrano," the commissioner violently barked. "Massive hands exactly where I can clearly see them." "It was officially him," Diego violently screamed, highly aggressively pointing directly at Marcos, exactly as the highly massive officers aggressively pushed him completely against the hard wall. "He is officially the highly toxic mastermind. I am absolutely just a highly innocent witness." "Shut your pathetic mouth, you spineless, pathetic worm!" Marcos violently yelled exactly as the heavy handcuffs loudly clicked completely around his pale wrists. Sarah confidently stood perfectly still, entirely in the absolute center, entirely of the massive chaos. Exactly like the highly calm eye, entirely of a highly violent hurricane. She intensely watched exactly as the exact toxic man who had violently broken her fragile heart was highly aggressively dragged completely away, violently crying and highly pathetically begging. He frantically attempted to actively catch her piercing gaze exactly one absolute last, highly desperate time, loudly screaming her beautiful name. But she simply, highly elegantly, turned her broad back completely on him exactly when the heavy doors finally, smoothly closed, flawlessly leaving the massive room completely, beautifully silent entirely once again. The king and the queen. Sarah let out a highly massive, incredibly deep sigh that she profoundly felt she had absolutely been highly anxiously holding completely in entirely for exactly 7 agonizing years. She heavily slumped completely against the highly heavy, massive oak desk, her weak legs physically feeling exactly like pure jelly. "Are you perfectly okay?" Leo was absolutely already completely right perfectly there. His highly strong, warm hand
highly gently resting completely on her fragile shoulder. Sarah intensely looked completely around the massive office. It was highly incredibly messy. It highly aggressively smelled entirely of spilled expensive whiskey, but entirely for the absolute first time. It profoundly felt completely, undeniably, hers. "I desperately need to highly urgently call the Zaragoza factory," Sarah stated, her beautiful voice violently trembling slightly, but highly rapidly aggressively gaining massive strength completely, with absolutely every single heavy word. "I desperately need to highly explicitly tell them that their highly loyal jobs are completely, perfectly safe. And then, I desperately need to successfully find a highly brilliant, brand new chief financial officer." She intensely looked directly at Leo. The highly massive, blinding adrenaline was actively, beautifully fading completely away, flawlessly leaving completely behind a highly raw, completely exposed, absolute honesty. "Leo," she softly stated, "you confidently returned. You highly bravely risked your elite career, your pristine reputation, completely entirely for me." "Why exactly?" Leo intensely looked directly at her. The highly professional, highly impeccable mask he absolutely always flawlessly wore had completely, beautifully, but completely away. His piercing green eyes were incredibly soft, completely filled entirely with a highly profound emotion that absolutely terrified her, and highly enthusiastically thrilled her completely at the exact same highly magical time. Arturo explicitly wrote exactly one absolute last, highly massive thing entirely in the secret diary, Leo stated incredibly quietly. Entirely on the absolute final page. What exactly did he explicitly write, Leo? He highly gently reached completely into the small notebook and flawlessly turned completely to the absolute final, highly specific entry. He smoothly handed it directly to her. Sarah intensely looked directly at the highly violently trembling handwriting, entirely of the highly exhausted old man she had highly generously given hot soup to. "I highly generously leave my massive company completely to Sarah, entirely, because she flawlessly possesses a highly good, pure heart. I highly generously leave Sarah completely to you, entirely, because you desperately need exactly one. She is officially the absolute best massive thing that has absolutely ever miraculously happened, completely to this massive city. Do absolutely not actively be a highly pathetic idiot. Do absolutely not generously let her actively be completely alone. She fiercely deserves an absolute, true king. Absolutely not a highly pathetic jester exactly like Diego." Sarah slowly looked completely up, hot tears beautifully spilling completely over her dark eyelashes. He explicitly wrote exactly that," Leo beautifully smiled. "And entirely for the highly official record, I absolutely actively planned to confidently return absolutely even completely before I vividly saw the highly explosive news. I literally could not highly successfully concentrate entirely in massive London. I highly constantly actively kept deeply thinking entirely about you. Entirely about exactly how you beautifully look, exactly when you fiercely fight completely for highly innocent people. Entirely about exactly how you beautifully smile, exactly when you genuinely think absolutely no one is intensely looking." Leo slowly approached significantly closer, flawlessly closing the highly small, intimate distance completely between them. He gently reached completely out and highly softly brushed a highly wet lock entirely of hair, completely from her pale forehead. I absolutely no longer desperately want to actively be your highly elite lawyer, Sarah, he whispered incredibly softly. I desperately want to actively be the true man who confidently stands perfectly entirely by your beautiful side. Sarah's massive heart violently hammered completely against her fragile ribs. She highly gently reached completely out, lovingly placing her soft hand completely on his broad chest. It physically felt incredibly solid, highly real. I genuinely think, Sarah whispered incredibly softly, that I am completely, utterly ready, entirely, to highly happily accept exactly that highly massive resignation. Leo smoothly leaned completely in, and exactly when his warm lips finally, beautifully found hers, it absolutely wasn't exactly like the highly freezing, bitter rain entirely in the dark alley. It was incredibly warm. It was highly electric. It was an absolute, highly beautiful promise outside. The highly violent storm had finally, beautifully broken, completely apart. The highly dark, heavy clouds were miraculously separating, flawlessly revealing the highly brilliant, beautiful skyline entirely of the massive city that Sarah Jimenez exactly now completely, utterly owned. But exactly as she confidently stood perfectly entirely in the highly warm, highly protective arms, entirely of the exact true man who had miraculously saved her, she profoundly realized that she had highly miraculously inherited absolutely something significantly, infinitely, more highly valuable than a multi-billion euro massive empire. She had miraculously, beautifully, found her absolute, highly undeniable worth. And this highly specific time. Absolutely no one was actively going to absolutely ever violently take it completely away entirely from her. Diego Serrano highly arrogantly desperately wanted a highly pathetic trophy wife and a highly rapid, massive fortune. But he highly pathetically ended completely up entirely with a highly massive federal prison sentence and a highly pathetic entire lifetime entirely of absolute regret. He agonizingly learned completely the highly brutal, incredibly hard way that you absolutely should never, ever highly toxically judge a highly complex book completely by its highly glossy cover, or a highly exhausted beggar completely by his highly cheap, torn coat. Sarah flawlessly, beautifully demonstrated that absolute, true, massive power is absolutely not entirely about the massive money completely in your highly secure bank account. It is entirely about the absolute, pure integrity completely in your highly beautiful soul. In the absolute end, the highly simple waitress flawlessly, highly beautifully served the arrogant multimillionaire exactly, precisely exactly what he completely, utterly deserved. A highly freezing, cold plate entirely of massive karma, and a highly massive, highly satisfying side dish entirely of absolute, pure justice. What an absolutely incredible, breathtaking ending to a highly emotional story. Do you fiercely think Diego got exactly what he deserved with his prison sentence? What was your favorite moment of Sarah's ultimate revenge? Drop your fierce thoughts in the comments below. Please don't forget to smash that like button, share this incredible story of karma, and subscribe to our channel for more explosive, satisfying stories. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.